Hey everyone, Delve here. Today I'm going to go over the Conjuration skill in Oblivion, as well as some other tidbits about followers. Conjuration is more or less my favorite skill in the game, and generally considered to be the other quintessential way to beat Oblivion at max difficulty, other than destruction. The main thing to note about conjured monsters is that they deal full damage to enemies, even on max difficulty, so it's sort of like playing the game on normal difficulty. The downside is that your damage comes from monsters, which obviously have kind of wacky AI that makes weird decisions. It's also pretty magicka intensive, but it's a fun way to do things. Starting the game out, I recommend the High Elf. You'll probably want the extra magicka. The downside to High Elf is that it has 25% weakness to fire, frost, and shock, so we could also consider Breton to help make ourselves immune to magic instead. But for this character, the weaknesses don't really matter, and additionally the bonus magicka will just get us rolling a tiny bit faster, so it's worth doing. High Elf is, crucially, the fastest race by default, which is extremely helpful in running past the rats. Otherwise pretty difficult as any other race. So that is one massive perk that High Elves enjoy, and really nice if you don't need to level any skills in the tutorial. Now that that's out of the way, we can talk about Star Sign. Usually the Apprentice isn't really workable, but for this particular character, it's not so much of an issue. Obviously on max difficulty, 100% weakness to magic alongside High Elf racial weakness makes you die instantly to most magic, but magic is pretty dangerous anyway, and this character is well equipped to avoid most enemy spells. You could also of course go Breton with the Mage, and then that way you'd be resistant to magic as opposed to weak to it, but the 100 extra magicka will make our lives just a tiny bit easier, which is worth it to me for this particular character. For class, magic specialization and bonus intelligence and willpower. For skills, I went with alteration, armor, conjuration, destruction, illusion, light armor, and restoration. These spell schools all have various applications that we'll get into later, and I don't really recommend skipping any of them, although you could in fact probably do away with alteration and restoration, but there really aren't any other skills worth taking. Armor and light armor are also extremely optional, but they aren't bad choices all things considered, because a conjuration-based character is obviously going to be able to get their hands on free bound armor, using the bound weapons and armor glitch. I already talked about this before, but the gist is that you can conjure a weapon or some armor, have an enemy damage it, repair it, drop it on the ground, and then wait an hour to make it permanent and 0 weight. Having more defenses doesn't really do anything for this character defensively, at least not without a whole lot of additional effort. You could also very easily swap these out for things like mercantile, athletics, security, or skills like that if you want something that's guaranteed to at least be kind of useful. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, it's time to talk about Conjuration and the summons themselves. Conjuration levels really fast, and we should have enough mana to summon powerful monsters, so it's just to justify using a lot of the early game summons. Nevertheless, they can be decently useful, especially as a crutch for another kind of character if you have less magicka. The first is the basic skeleton. This is nice because you start the game with it, and you should be spamming it. Facing any halfway decent enemy, it crumples almost immediately, but you can also just summon another one, so it can very easily do a decent job at low levels. Now you will want to swap it out just about immediately for another spell, so be prepared to sell some alchemy supplies or get some gold some other way. Your immediate knee-jerk might be to go for some other of the basic summons at 25 skill, aka apprentice level, and here's a list of the pretty good ones, including the zombie, the scamp, and the ghost. All of these have the crucial weakness that Conjuration is a skill that levels really quickly, so as long as you have enough magicka, there's no point in spending your precious limited gold on any of these spells. The Ghost and Scamp are decent spellcaster summons in Frost and Fire respectively, but generally the Zombie is probably the best overall because it's extremely durable and has high melee damage. I personally held out for 50 Conjuration or Journeyman level skill before I started doing quests. Almost all the summons at Journeyman level are pretty terrible, and there aren't that many of them, but Headless Zombie is also extremely durable and hits really hard in melee, just like the basic zombie. I use this for the arena quest line, but it's important to note that this spell is pretty handily outclassed by the summons you'll get access to at 75 Conjuration skill, which is expert level. But before I talk about expert level spells, I should talk about illusion once again. Unfortunately, Conjuration is one of the skills that essentially requires illusion, not necessarily for every enemy, but frequently enough. Some enemies in this game are simply programmed to target you and only you, to the point that if you go invisible, they'll just allow a summon to attack them to death without retaliating. This is obviously really annoying, and if you don't have really high magic resistance, they'll often just instantly kill you with spells, so it's pretty impractical to play this character without the support of illusion. So I do recommend at the very least rushing to 50 illusion for the basic invisibility spell, and if you started as High Elf with the Apprentice Burst Sign, it shouldn't be an issue to be able to afford this spell. But as long as you aren't dealing with one of these enemies that only targets you, most enemies are polite enough to focus on your summons, so invisibility isn't something you'll have to use constantly. And that's just how Oblivion is. You have two choices at high difficulty. You can either make your defenses extremely high via magic resistance, spell absorption, and shield effects, or you can simply go invisible. The only real reason I've consistently used illusion is because it's faster and easier Illusion also gives you access to silence, which makes really tedious summoner enemies much easier to deal with, as your summons will tend to try to fight their summons instead of killing the summoner. Now you could of course try to use Paralyze on them, but again that's also an illusion spell. For most enemies these spells aren't necessary, but for summoners and healers, and for Mankar Cameron in particular, this is unfortunately all too necessary. So realistically you truly just don't have another option, and in fact I would go so far as to say that Conjuration needs the support of illusion more than any other skill in the game. But back to the summons. At 75 Conjuration skill, or expert level, things start getting really interesting. First I have to give props to the Clannfear. It's less durable than your other options, but it also moves extremely quickly and does good damage, especially to low level targets. If you want to absolutely humiliate the game and one-shot every enemy, you can just stay level 2, and the only 2 spells you'll need are Summon Clannfear and the 30-second invisibility spell. Now I didn't do that, but it is worth going over, because it absolutely is the easiest way to beat the game, period. Next we have the Daedroth. It costs a bit more magicka to summon than the Clannfear, but it hits slightly harder and is a decent amount bulkier. This is the game's most iconic summon, and you don't need any other summons to beat the whole game if you want. It will often do pretty solid against even endgame enemies, and of course you can always just summon another one if it dies, with very few enemies being able to stand up to more than 2 or 3 of them in a row. It can sometimes struggle against enemies which also have summons, but if you position them correctly, they should eventually be able to target the summoner, and you'll usually be able to wear these enemies down through sheer numbers. It also struggles with large groups of enemies, but because it's a melee summon, it's also the ideal summon for any scenario involving allies, as their melee attacks will never accidentally hit an ally. I actually don't think it's the strongest summon in the game overall, but you will still almost certainly need it for a handful of the game's enemies. For example, it's very powerful against Zivilai, who have a ton of magic absorption, and against Mankar Cameron as well. It's also very cost efficient, punching way above its weight in terms of how much magicka you are spending to cast it. So assuming you are leveling up, you will want this summon. It's not perfect though. It does love to cast its own weak spells, and it also loves to sort of just stand in place and miss enemies a lot, kind of just running into them. But that's just Conjuration in a nutshell for you, and you can't expect any summon to do really that much better. Melee damage is obviously kind of a pure numbers game, so there's not much reason to bother with any other melee-oriented summons, although they aren't necessarily bad either. Skeleton summons are at least immune to paralysis, so if that's a problem, you can try a Skeleton Champion. There are also 2 summons from the Shivering Isles, several levels of Shambles and Hunger summons. These creatures are primarily melee-oriented, but also seem to not do quite as well as a Daedroth. The thing about the Daedroth and the Clannfear is that they have the same kind of leaping attack that a rat does. Now the Hunger also has this, but it also costs more to summon a Voracious Hunger than it does to summon a Daedroth, and the extra cost basically isn't worth it, as it also loves to cast weak trained fatigue spells. But it is mostly the same and could be used interchangeably if you wanted. For the Replete Shambles, it's okay. It has the same AI pattern as the summonable Frost and Storm Atronachs, and just doesn't do anything unique or interesting, but it's not unusable or anything like that, except that I've also heard it's bugged in the remaster and does nothing, so your mileage may vary. Now most of the remaining summons are spellcasting summons, including all the best summons at 100 skill or master level, and because there's a lot of types of magic in the game, some of them can have some solid niche uses and even actually be better than the Daedroth in many scenarios. This is why we took Destruction actually, because we can pretty easily cast a 100% weakness to magic, fire, frost, or shock for 10 seconds or so, and easily augment the damage of these summons to pretty absurd levels. And keep in mind, we don't even really need to stack the weakness effects like we do with Destruction magic. The damage from summons is high enough that even a single good weakness spell is going to allow your summon to rapidly kill enemies. In general, I don't recommend having a bunch of custom spells. The only real one you need is a 100% weakness to magic on target for 10 seconds, although you will need at least 50 destruction to be able to cast that, so I also recommend making a custom destruction training spell as well. The first notable caster summon is the Fated Wraith at expert level. Not only is this a very cost-efficient summon, it also has a ton of good frost spells, including a silence spell that also does frost damage. It's great for fighting enemies at a range, silencing pesky spellcasters, and dealing with enemies resistant to fire or shock damage. Its AI also loves to cast its spells, so it can easily plow through enemies, including Storm Atronachs or spellcasting Dremora. Really handy all-around summon that I recommend having in the pocket, and it's even pretty durable as well. Now you may wonder about the theoretically superior Gloom Wraith at master level. In my testing it was actually less efficient because it seemed to want to cast fewer spells overall, and fewer of its own really good spells. It also costs more, but in reality they are probably interchangeable. Either way, if you are looking for an insanely strong caster summon for the least amount of magicka, either one of these seems like they can outclass the Daedroth, assuming you apply a weakness effect, or against certain enemies or in fringe scenarios. Next is the Storm Atronach. This is the most cost-efficient summon at master level. Its immunity to shock is really nice, as enemies seem to love to cast shock spells. Unfortunately, its own shock spells are pretty weak overall, so I certainly don't think it's one of the stronger spellcasting summons. With that being said, it is very bulky and comes with damage reflection, so a very solid option in any scenario where you are dealing with powerful melee opponents, such as Daedroth or high-level zombies. Its attack hitbox is also extremely good. Most attacks from summons seem to whiff pretty frequently, which can be kind of annoying. I'd say maybe 50% of summon attacks don't hit. Now, its melee attack isn't especially good, but it's also so consistent at hitting them that it probably works out to be nearly as good as a Daedroth. So if it seems like your summons are struggling to hit opponents, you could certainly try a Storm Atronach and they're not bad. The last summon I'll go over is the Lich. This is my personal favorite summon. I also think that it's actually the best summon in the game, but it does also have some major weaknesses and caveats that are extremely important to go over. The biggest thing is that it comes with random spells and stabs, all of which are master level and therefore extremely high quality. Unfortunately, this does not necessarily mean the Lich itself will be an effective combatant, as a lot of the spells in its pool just aren't that effective, including random alteration and mysticism spells, which essentially do little to nothing in combat. It can cast a powerful silence spell, but you certainly can't rely on getting that Lich in particular, nor does that guarantee that it also happens to have a good damage spell as well. Furthermore, the Lich does also love to just stand around in lots of scenarios, so be aware of that. Not sure if it has to do with line of sight or proximity, but there's another huge issue with the Lich. When the Lich does have high quality damage spells though, they're extremely effective combatants that can rapidly kill opponents, especially when you apply a weakness to magic effect. But of course, because you'll never know in advance if a Lich has fire, frost, or shock spells, it can be cost prohibitive to make a weakness spell which includes all three elements. Now if you get a Lich with bad spells, you can also just re-summon another one, but it's also the most expensive type of summon in the game, so depending on your character, it may just not be viable to summon Liches at all. Assuming you are running the High Elf with the Apprentice Burst sign, the Lich can also very easily kill you with friendly fire, as the master level spells have a massive area of effect, especially the Frost spell, so I was killed by my own summoned Lich a comedically high number of times. It does have spell reflection though, so it's a perfect summon for scenarios with big wide open spaces, caster enemies, and a whole bunch of enemies, so that its splash damage spells can do the maximum amount of damage to all the target. Otherwise, in most cases, a Daedroth will be much safer and more consistent. Just like the Fated Wraith, however, I wouldn't necessarily sleep on the summon if you feel like your Daedroth isn't cutting the mustard. Just be aware that it is very inconsistent, even if it is extremely impressive when it does cast its really strong spells. And those are really the best summons in the game, although honorable mention should go out to the Frost Atronach, Replete Shamble, Skeleton Champion, Voracious Hunger, Gloom Wraith, and Zivali for probably being decent enough that you could use them if you really felt like it. I've already mentioned a bunch of these. Honestly, any of these endgame summons are good enough in most scenarios, when you consider the fact that you can very easily just summon another one when it dies or expires. That's really the fun of Conjuration, although it is my opinion that most of these summons are probably worse than the ones I recommended, as the summons I recommend really did perform above my expectations, whereas the rest of them kind of performed below my expectations. Now I'll talk briefly about custom Conjuration spells, and whether or not these are actually worth considering. So for example, the default spell to summon a Daedroth only lasts 35 seconds, but you can make a custom spell that increases that up to a whopping 120 seconds. The primary reason to do this would be so that you could buff the Daedroth with things like custom shield spells, and then that way they could become a lot harder to kill. I did try this, and I didn't find it to be especially compelling, considering you can always just summon another one. The bigger issue was fiddling with defensive spells themselves. Summoning a Daedroth for 120 seconds was pretty expensive, and then casting a spell to give it 70 shield for 120 seconds was also pretty expensive. It's also significantly harder to give it magic resistance or spell absorption, since those effects are really expensive, and so are healing spells, so you'll never really make it perfectly invincible, and you probably will need a good amount of magicka to even get the 70 shield on it, maybe around 500 magicka at least. With that being said, a Daedroth with maxed out shield for 120 seconds is a very solid combatant, even against annoying summoner enemies. Because it's around that armor cap of 85, it will be largely immune to physical attacks, and this is a solid avenue for how to do things if you really want to. The main issue is that it was a lot of magicka to spend for a summon that I thought wasn't even really better than a really good Lich, as far as I could tell, although with silence, it would probably be a lot more efficient against some really annoying enemies. So not at all a bad way to do things, and you could also apply Chameleon to it as well to make it simply untargetable and just like kind of invincible, although that would be pretty expensive for even as little as 60 seconds. That covers about all you can do with Conjuration summons. Next I'm going to talk about building an army with followers, which is appropriately thematic for this character. As I said in a previous video, followers are pretty terrible. This game just isn't Skyrim. There are of course lots of quest followers like Earthor, but I don't really like these because as far as I know they're always terrible. So we'll skip these, they just don't level up with you. Instead I'll focus on followers that are easy to get our hands on and hopefully better in combat. The first one is the Atronach follower from Frostcrag Spire. To summon one, you'll need to offer 3 Fire, Frost, or Void Salts. It's a free Atronach, and Frost and Storm Atronachs are decent allies overall, and if you're high level, you'll find plenty of Void Salts in places like Oblivion Gates, so there's no reason not to have one of these at any given moment, other than it's kind of tedious to heal them or to replace them if they die, which is the core problem with these, that they will die a lot. The next follower is the Battlehorn Man-at-Arms, which can be easily recruited from Battlehorn Castle just by going there and killing the bandits out front. If the Man-at-Arms dies, they can be easily re-recruited from the Battlehorn Castle after a few days of waiting for them to respawn. As I already talked about in the Blunt Guide, these guys are decent allies with good weapons, but when their armor or weapons breaks, they become very terrible. One thing you can try is to pickpocket conjured armor pieces onto them, and they will equip them after fast traveling. Note that you can only pickpocket items with 0 weight. The easiest way to pickpocket them effectively is to have a custom Chameleon 100% spell on self, and you won't need the effect to last longer than 3 seconds or so. Although they won't actually gain that much defense out of it, this is because they only have heavy armor as a tag skill, but most of these conjured armor pieces are light armor for some reason. I couldn't ever get them to equip a bound weapon, but at high levels they come with ebony swords, so that part doesn't really matter that much. You could of course also enchant these pieces to give them bonus shield or magic resistance, all kinds of stuff like that to make them essentially invincible, but obviously that would require doing a lot of Oblivion Gates, and you'd also need to have an armor scale of at least 50 to be able to repair them when necessary, which is why I took armor, even if I never actually got around to doing this. Now this all sounds great, but there's a major crippling flaw to this, that being that sometimes fast traveling to some locations will cause their inventories to purge, which just destroys all their custom armor, so they're too tedious to really make use of. It seems like it happens in many cities, but there's really no telling when and where this could exactly be an issue. But even if this wasn't the case, none of the game's followers can be taken into Paradise at the end of the game, and they also can't be taken into places like the Shivering Isles, rendering them cool in theory but largely useless where it counts. I did find these to be exceptionally useful in one specific place, that being the Great Gate battle with Martin near the end of the game. Ordinarily, I just use a custom 100% Chameleon effect on him to cheese the battle, as keeping him alive is a huge pain, especially at high levels. But it turns out that with a Man-at-Arms, an Atronach, and a summoned Daedroth, this battle gets a lot easier. I also kitted out Bird with a set of conjured armor during the Brumagate quest, and potentially you could do this with some of the other allies at the Great Gate as well, although that would probably be pretty tedious. Overall, I was really pleasantly surprised you could actually bring your own reinforcements to this quest, as I was beginning to think that the only way to survive at high levels was to either use Chameleon on Martin, or to complete a whole bunch of Oblivion Gates to get better soldiers. Speaking of the Great Gate, that actual gate itself is timed, so here's another spot where you will probably need Illusion just for invisibility to run past all the enemies. Okay, up until this point there hasn't been much to stop us, even if some enemies are a bit of a pain. Mankar Cameron is the exception. He loves to summon his own Daedra, and he has his 2 children to be a problem, and he can heal himself, so there's not much a summon can do, even for a Lich or a really strong Daedroth. Now, if you had maxed out defenses instead of Illusion, you could drain his mana by absorbing all of his spells and kill him off that way, but assuming you don't, this fight is going to be a really massive problem. Ultimately, you have 2 choices. You can start by killing his children outside of the arena, and then silence him for 120 seconds, and then a Daedroth should be able to kill him fairly easily. Note that he has 50% resistance to magic, so the silence will only last for 60 seconds, but it should be enough time anyway. Alternatively, you can choose not to kill his children, and then cast a 25-point command humanoid spell, and get them to fight him for you. I was able to kill him using this without silence, but you may need silence in some scenarios just to stop him from healing. Frenzy also seemed to work as well, but again silence goes a long way here, and even at high levels I found this to be a decent strategy. Not that I tried it that many times. I did try a bunch of other things, like enchanting a shield with fire damage and then reverse pickpocketing it onto him alongside a dagger, but this didn't work even after I broke his staff, and so I think you may only have the option of using a combination of control humanoid and silence and invisibility, and that's really your only option without deviating into some other forms of dealing damage. You could also weakness stack and have a Fated Wraith or Eldamil one-shot him, but as usual his high magic resistance, spell absorption, and spell reflection do pose an issue for that, but it is absolutely possible. And of course you could also just be level 2, and then summon a Clannfear right next to him, and there's a good chance it'll kill him in a handful of attacks. So that's another option. Okay, and that's basically the Conjuration guide. Again, it's one of my favorite skills, even if it looks a little lousy sometimes, as your summons brawl with the enemies. And of course enemies that summon and heal are the real Achilles heel, so you will almost certainly want or need Illusion to back it up. Hopefully this is the last time I'll use Illusion for the rest of these guides. I was, however, really impressed with how effective it really felt like a lot of the endgame summons are, especially the Lich and the Daedroth, even if a lot of them are really fringe, like the Fated Wraith or whatever. And lastly, of course, I'd like to thank various YouTubers, including a Kiss Hairseg, Schneller Herring, the Old Knight, and Iced Coffee Gaming as well. He did a good tier list for these summons that taught me some interesting tricks, although his tier list was for the remaster, so keep that in mind. And then of course the UASP and fandom wikis as well. Without those, I doubt this would be possible, so thanks to them, and thank you for watching.